Welcome to your daily dose of theological German. We are on installment number 14 in Adolf Schlatter's The Evangelist John. And as I keep on saying, these are excerpted from Ziefle's graded German theological reader. I encourage you to get a copy of that if you don't have one. So once again, a very easy sentence today, but we will find things to talk about, just like we did yesterday. Today, actually, there's a couple of interesting things we can sort of remind ourselves about how you go about figuring things out in a German sentence when there are some ambiguities. But anyway, what does this say? They oppose Jesus in the same, this is a compound word here, the same, in the same way, and receive from him the same promise. And so they here is referring to the Samaritan woman and Nicodemus. You'll have to watch yesterday's episode to kind of get the full context. So this is obviously a pretty straightforward sentence, but there's a few interesting things going on here. The first thing to note is that you have two clauses, and so it's joined here by und, these two clauses. And so you have two verbs that go in each of those two clauses. And these clauses are of equal status. Neither one is subordinated to the other. Und is a conjunction which, at least in this case, is functioning to simply join two independent clauses. And so in an independent clause, your verb is always going to show up in second position. And that is the case here, except you might notice and be wondering, hey, you keep saying about verbs being in second position or at the end of a subordinate clause, and yet empfangen here, the verb in the second clause, appears to be in first, so-called, I guess you could call it, first position. It's the first word. How is this happening? Well, the thing you have to recognize here is that what's actually going on is you have this conjunction und is joining two clauses, but the two clauses that it's joining are being joined at this point. So you have the first one starting here and going to here, and then the second one starting here and going to here. And what that leaves you with up front is the subject, sie, they. And this subject is your subject for both clauses. And so that's why, and in fact, we do the same thing in English. So English has an even stricter kind of word order situation in some ways than German. And yet in English, we do the same thing. In English, you're not supposed to be able to form a clause without a subject, verb, object structure. And yet we would do the same thing. And I think I even translated it this way when I said they challenged or opposed Jesus in the same way and received from him the same promise. In that second clause in English, I did not supply a subject. I actually just started that clause with a verb, so it violates the same kind of English grammatical principle as what appears to be being violated here. But as I've explained it, that's basically what's going on, is that the subject is functioning as the first element for both clauses. And so you basically just have to figure out where your verb is in second position with respect to that initial subject, which kind of sort of stands off by itself then in the way that I've analyzed it. So what else can we say about this sentence? Well, there's one interesting thing to note here. You might just find this I find these kind of things just sort of like interesting to always think about. This Weiss is actually an English cognate of the word way, but even more closely than you might think. Of course, Weiss, way, you can sort of see it, but if you think of the word clockwise in English, you can see here that this wise part at the end is very similar to Weise in German. And yeah, anyway, so that's just kind of interesting to think about archaic English expressions, which are so much more closely related to English than even more contemporary cognates. And finally, the last thing I want to point out is just real quick how we do deal with ambiguities. I think sometimes we have a tendency when we're learning a language like German to just try to memorize paradigms and think that that's going to help us answer all the questions we have. And so if we just know the paradigm for pronouns, we'll be able to identify this subject. And then if we just know the paradigm for verbs, we'll just be able to identify that this is a present plural. But it's actually not so straightforward because, of course, if you memorize these paradigms, you'll know that sie could actually be a third person feminine. And so you might want to translate this as she. So you've got an ambiguity when it comes to morphology. And you might say, yes, but I've already resolved that because the verb is a present plural. And we know that, of course, just because of the verbal form here with the ending. And since it's a present plural, then you can't have a singular subject, and so it's going to be the plural subject, and so boom, ambiguity resolved. The problem is this verbal form here, widerstreben, is also identical, morphologically speaking, to the infinitive. And so you've got more ambiguities, because if it's infinitive, then there's no reason why your subject cannot be a singular. And so then you have to say, well, how do I know that's not an infinitive? And the reason why you know is that your German word order is really quite strict. And this is why it really matters. In some languages, because they have case endings and relatively strict morphological distinctions between things, you can kind of do whatever you want with word order in some languages. But in German, you really can't. There are some flexibilities, but it's quite strict, and that is to say that you have a word order that helps you determine whether a verb is a conjugated verb or else a complementary verb. And so if this was an infinitive, it would have to be at the end of the clause, and then you would have to have some other conjugated verb as an auxiliary in things like a future tense or something like that. And so because we don't have that, then we know that what we are dealing with here is a conjugated verb, and if it's conjugated, it's not infinitive, and therefore the only other option is that it's plural, and so then you know what your subject is. And that might seem somewhat pedantic to people that have been doing German for a while, but it's just important to realize you have to kind of work through that process to at least prove to yourself that your translation is correct and that you have resolved anything that might have appeared to be ambiguous and why you did it the way that you did it. So anyways, I hope you find that helpful. As always, thank you for watching, and do subscribe and like and all of those good things, and we'll see you next time.